Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thanks everyone, and I want to welcome you to the 14th annual Research Ethics Conference of the Colorado Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute. I want to welcome, of course, those in person, those who brave the weather. Welcome also to the people who are joining us on Zoom. My name is Matt DeCamp. I'm an associate professor here at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities. I'm also the director of research ethics for the CCTSI, a role I assumed a couple of years ago from Marilyn Coors. I'm going to start with just a couple housekeeping issues. Restrooms, if you need them, are on this level, a level below us, and a level above us. We will have a short break around 1:35, and then we'll return for 3 more presentations after that and a panel discussion. I really hope you'll be able to stay for the entire time. Another housekeeping issue for those in the room, if you have preferences about not being on the camera for Zoom, you need to be up in this quadrant where I'm pointing. This won't mean anything to the Zoom people, but where I'm pointing. I want to also start with a couple of thank yous. I want to thank Dr. Sokol and Higgins of the CCTSI for supporting this event. Thanks also go to Tim Lockey, Goldie Komai, Lily Vessel as well at CCTSI. On the center side, it's taken a real team to put this event together. Anna McLean and Malia Himber, as well as my colleague Ahmed Alismar, who will be here to monitor time during some of the flash presentations. And lastly, thanks to the Research Ethics Committee, who helps in the planning of this event, David Badish, Terry Hernandez, Curtis Coughlin, Gianna Morales, and Brian Jackson. Some of those folks will be here today. Our topic today is ethics and research with decentralized elements. This is a hot topic at the moment. And while it owes a lot of that to the current funding priorities in COVID-19, a pandemic that in some ways forced us to take research directly to participants by mail or electronic communication or otherwise, one thing I want us to come away with today is the recognition that research with decentralized elements long precedes COVID-19. From global health to innovative research design, the question we want to continually ask today is what lessons can we learn from these prior efforts that can inform current ones and the current emphasis on decentralized pragmatic research. And to do that, we're going to draw on a lot of experts from within the CCTSI across our different partners and across different parts of the translational science spectrum, as well as an invited keynote speaker. As we proceed, given the tight time frame we're going to run this afternoon, I want to point those in the room to the handouts of bio sketches that are positioned at different parts of the room. If you need to read bios, you can pick up a copy of that. Ahmed will post an electronic version of those bios into the chat online for those on Zoom. And as such, I'll try to keep intros in between speakers relatively brief, maybe with one exception, and that's where I'll turn now, and that's to our invited keynote speaker, Dr. Barbara Bierer, an author or co-author of more than 300 publications and a hematologist oncologist. Dr. Bierer is the director of the Regulatory Foundation's Ethics and Law program of the Harvard Clinical and Translational Science Center, and the director and PI of Streamlined Multi-Site Accelerated Resources for Trials IRB Reliance Platform, better known as the SMART platform or SMART IRB. Dr. Bierer co-founded and leads the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard, which is a collaborative effort to improve standards for the planning and conduct of clinical trials to harmonize policies and approaches to clinical trial regulation. And while Dr. Bierer is going to share her thoughts today on ethics and research involving decentralized elements, her work clearly goes beyond this topic. I'll highlight just one. In the October 19th issue of JAMA, Dr. Bierer wrote eloquently on the 60th anniversary of the Declaration of Helsinki, which lays out ethics principles. Many of us are familiar with these principles. Principles governing medical research that was adopted in 1964 by the World Medical Association. Her article notes important changes that have come about to this document, such as an emphasis on community consultation and engagement, which we'll hear about later today, and expands on the shift toward responsible inclusion in research. At the same time, she asks really unanswered questions about ethics and consent in the use of data for pragmatic and comparative effectiveness research, another topic we'll hear about today. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Bierer, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and thank you for inviting me. I'm not used to theater in the round, so I don't know exactly where to stand. I am honored to be here. I have 120 slides for 15, 45 minutes or something. So I'm going to do my grew up in New York. I'm going to talk as fast as I can. If you can't understand me, please let me know. And let me start with the fact that I gave a title and then I saw that the announcement had a different title, but it's still ethics issues in DCTs, decentralized trials, but I don't think they're out of sight and out of mind. So we're going to dissect that. And I thought first I want to disclaim the fact that I have any financial contributions to the work I do. I will be receiving, I think, an honorarium. I would be here even if I weren't. Just for you to note that if you need an extra. And none of these opinions are those of my institutions, although I think they all should be. Um, so the whoops. So the MRCT Center, which I founded with a friend of mine, a lawyer, and Mark Barnes, and the about 15 years ago, is a research and policy center at Harvard and now Harvard and the Brigham that really looks at the ethics, conduct, and regulatory environment of multinational, multi site trials. And we do that by pulling together, identifying emerging issues, and then pulling together regulators, pharma companies, CROs, patient advocates, academics to sort of figure out what the problem really is and what the operational challenges are, and then try to find solutions or propose solutions that will work for all. Thinking that if everyone's around the table, it has a better chance of success. And amongst those issues was the rise of changes in COVID-19, and amongst them, the increased deployment of DCTs or decentralized clinical trials, which is what I will focus on today. Um, for those of you taking notes, I'm happy to share my slides. So you can just sit back and listen. Um, so the learning objectives, I'm not a big believer in them, but I had to have them. And so let me just set the stage. DCTs was turbocharged by COVID-19, but almost every clinical trial, as Matt said, had decentralized elements um, prior to COVID-19. You know, I'm a hematologist oncologist. If I could let my patients get a blood draw locally and send the note, send the labs, I did. I didn't even know I had to worry about it. I didn't know that I had to make arrangements for that. We just did that. But now there's a whole focus on what you should be thinking about, partly because it's much more common. Um, and planning is essential. And what I'd recommend is thinking about, and I'm going to spend about half the time talking about giving you a flavor for some of the issues and then talking about some of the ways to think about it. But planning is essential, and thinking about every element that could be decentralized, how that works, what the issues are, and really where patient safety, patient well-being, and patient rights are impacted, or participant, forgive me, and then what do we need to worry about in terms of the data integrity and reliability. But what we don't do, and where I think we need to start doing much better than we do, is understanding the data flow. It used to be that we would have a clinical trial and would write down, or sort of use the EHR, the medical record, or the research record to keep those results. Now, there are so many systems that flow into one another. If we don't understand the data architecture, we're missing a lot of potential risks and considerations. Um, this is not only the responsibility of the IRB, it's also an institutional responsibility. And institutions, I think, have been slow to adopt and accept that responsibility and charge. The PI role is changing. We need to figure out how to support the PIs in doing this work. Um, and um, and the complexity is evolving. They have different things to worry about. But, the paradigmatic principles of human research protections and patient centricity remain the same. So, what is a DCT? It refers to a clinical trial that has decentralized elements where trial related activity occurs at locations other than traditional clinical trial sites. In other words, telehealth, local clinics, local imaging, uh, digital wearables, all of those kinds of things, ePros, electronic patient reported outcomes, um, and where the work is done not at the specialized facility. But what the lens that you should be looking at this through is what's different about a DCT from a regular trial or a traditional trial. Is this a fundamental change, or is it a different way of doing business? And if it's a different way of doing business, are eh, think about each of the elements of that and whether they're going to impact participant safety, well-being, or data. Um, so we used to be, physician and PI centric and ask everybody to come to the hospital or to the clinic that you're doing the research on. We did most of these things as in-person interactions. The labs and imaging were on site. Revenue was important, just joking. And now we're really thinking about participant-based. What can be brought to the participant? Can they go to the community? Can they go to a local lab or pharmacy? Can we send a visiting nurse at home? What about remote monitoring, etc.? And this is not either or. It's not that you have a traditional trial. Of course, maybe, um, you know, certain oncology trials, the infusion must be done in the hospital. But this is no longer an either or, and almost you think about it as a continuum. And why do we stress sort of working on clinical DCTs? Because it's convenient for the participant. It's not more convenient for the research staff, I can promise you. And you do decrease the burden for the participant, not for the research staff. It theoretically, it should increase access to clinical trials. We don't know if that's true, but that's what everybody thinks. It should increase the reach. It should also increase the diversity. If people with limited mobility, for instance, don't have to come in, they're more likely to say yes. And ideally, it should be more efficient and less cost. Some of that is hype, some of that has been shown. A lot of it is presumption and not data driven. When we think about benefit risk, we think about the intervention versus the available care. When a participant thinks about risk and benefit, they think about the potential benefit. That's balanced not just by the risk of the intervention or of the trial, but all of the other things in life. Imagine when we ask somebody to come in for a blood draw to the hospital or the clinic, waiting in the waiting room with everybody else, getting through traffic or public transportation, which takes 4 times longer, and then the cost both in time and expense. And we do it when it's convenient for the physician or clinical staff because it's got to be during our hours. So they have to take time off from work. So childcare or play. So that's sort of what we're working on and to avoid. The FDA has been very forward leaning in this. They published a draft guidance some time ago, changed it significantly, and published the final guidance in September. I'm referencing it here. As I say, you can have the slides. And those are the sections and the way they're thinking about it. This is for FDA regulated trials. EMA has a different set of regulations for trials in Europe. I'm going to focus only on the US from here. And And I'm not going to go through each of these things because I think that's very important, but you can read it. What I will say is I'm going to give you for the next sort of 5-10 minutes a flavor of some of these trials and what to think about. And then, as I said, the solutions. So first of all, the players are changing. It used to be a PI alone. The PI was the person and their study team responsible for supervising the conduct. That's still the same. They are responsible for the conduct of the trial and to protect the right, safety, and welfare of participants. Sub-investigators are any member of the team of individuals conducting an investigation other than the PI, and we usually have sub-investigators at sites different from the principal PI site. Those are sub-investigators. What's interesting is now we don't even know where those sites will be at the start of a DCT. So how do you coordinate your team when you don't even know where the patients or participants are going to be? And now, for the first time, the FDA introduced a concept called a healthcare practitioner. You know, the people in the community that see and sort of have the relationship with the participant, and that's any other healthcare practitioner that doesn't need and that is doing work in their scope of practice. They're not an investigator. They're not doing anything different. Um, if you're taking a blood pressure for a clinical trial, it's the same as a blood pressure for um, research until we found out we're all doing it wrong 2 weeks ago. Um, but there are things about a blood pressure for a clinical trial that are different. And when it's an endpoint for the trial, the FDA cares a lot about the quality of that measurement. So we need to think about that. So what do I say? First of all, DCT should be designed to be as flexible as possible and as limited as necessary to ensure participant safety and data reliability. There's often greater data variability. If you are doing, a procedure, in a controlled environment, or you're doing a lab test in your lab or an imaging in your facility, you have the normals, you have the experience, you're doing it the same every time. When you do that and you're asking people to do it locally or at home or with a nurse, it may be quite different. So you have to think about that variability. There's a risk of bias. People don't want to report certain things, and they're not being asked when they come in about potential adverse events or adverse reactions, so they may not recall them. They may over-report because they don't have the security of the relationship, and therefore everything might be an adverse event. And that the statistical analysis should accommodate those variabilities and therefore might need to be larger. So let's just think about remote clinical trial visits and clinical trial activities. So first of all, it can be done as usual in a traditional, hospital setting or clinic site. You can have telehealth visits if you need the interaction with a provider that is familiar with the clinical trial. Now, I don't know whether I'll go into the riff now. When we started doing a lot of telehealth visits during COVID-19, we started to realize all of the issues that come up. People do not have private places to have a conversation at home. They're in multi-generational housing. They don't want their physicians and care providers to see how they live. They want and don't know that you can blur the background. And then half of the people don't have stable internet or do not have internet or are not familiar with Zoom and with, sort of how to do a telehealth visit. So all of that is a different burden for participants, and we shouldn't make assumptions that they will automatically appreciate it. You can have the participant visit a local site for certain things, and even have those providers trained as delegated responsible investigators. But then you have to worry about when you're doing that, when you're supervising or monitoring from the IRB or from the institution, what responsibilities do you have for that person? The laboratory or imaging facility, what do they need to know about this trial in order to do it correctly? And then there's in-person visits by local personnel, either trained or HCPs to the home. And if it's a vendor, I mean, if it's a sponsored trial by pharmaceutical companies, they often contract with the vendor. So what is our, as the PI, what is our ability to know the competencies of the people that are doing that work? And meanwhile, our PIs are responsible for the conduct of that trial. How do you make sure that adverse events are identified, evaluated, monitored, and managed? What's the quality control around each of these things? How do you know about privacy and confidentiality of the data and of the interactions? We've had people go to their car in order to have a conversation on the telephone with the doc or with the research nurse. You know, we're not accounting for all of these things, nor are we forewarning the participants that they should be thinking about it, which should be, in my opinion, part of the intake. You know, sort of as you're consenting them, let's talk about how we're going to get this done together. But we don't do that. We don't. And then there's a question about, you know, the intervention and the investigational product. Is it stable? Can it, you know, can it, is it risky? You know, when my husband used to do research in the laboratory, he had cocaine delivered in a brown box. It said cocaine HCl. And one of my patients or participants complained that when they got a letter about a appointment, it said hepatitis research study as the return address. That kind of thing we're better at, but there's so much more of this now in DCTs that we should be thinking about each of those and sensitizing the research staff and investigators to be thinking about that as well. So let's just take an example. Randomized phase 3 study of a novel antihypertensive medicine is planned to be added to the standard of care for refractory high blood pressure. The medicine is taken orally daily and is stable. The trial will involve initial assessment on blood work, enrollment and consent, follow-up blood pressure medicine measurements, and blood draws for safety evaluations at 4, 12, and 24 weeks. So let's think to yourself, what trial activities here need to be done in the healthcare or hospital, the PI's facility or the investigator's facility? Do any of them want to see them the first time, do the evaluation, and then let everything else be done in the home if it's the participant preference? Or do you want to have them come back? You know, so like we should be designing these trials to give maximum flexibility. So now think about that. Who performs those activities? Is it the PI, even if it's video conferencing in, sub-I, or other, an HCP? There's nothing about this that is particularly different, except it's a novel antihypertensive agent. We don't know much about it. So what risks does that introduce? And are those risks likely to be immediate? No. So it's not like an infusion where you say, okay, you got to be in the hospital for the first one and then we can do the rest. Or even, you know, a vaccine or a sub-Q injection. What are the risks to participants' safety and well-being? And how can those be mitigated? How will the AEs and SAEs be identified? Where are they going to go to get care? Is there care locally? And what risk to participant privacy and confidentiality? What risk to data reliability and how are those mitigated? Would your assessment change if the investigational medicinal product were a marketed product for a new indication where we know a lot about the safety, administration, et cetera? It would for me. But in a new indication, maybe one, it's still investigational. If you're doing as a FDA regulated trial, if that data is going to the FDA at the end, and it would be for it's a novel phase 3, then whoever's contributing critical data to the analysis should be an investigator. They can't be an HCP. Well, that doesn't make sense if it's a marketed product. So, you know, where do we come down on that? Does it, um, so if it were an IV infusion, is it okay to do a nurse at home for the second? Is it easier to just bring them here? The costs are probably the same. Even the environmental sustainability is probably the same. What if the product needed refrigeration? Does that change your analysis? What if it's refractory, significant hypertension versus mild? Does that change your analysis? And what if the participant lived in a remote rural area? And we haven't even gotten to things like language, understanding, you know, technical sort of comfort, the digital divide that still exists in this country, et cetera. And how do those impact your review and HRPP responsibilities as an institution? That continues with clinical laboratory facilities that are close in proximity to the participant and may be adequate for routine clinical tests. Does it matter to you if it's Quest Diagnostics, if it's a community health center, or if it's, you know, sort of Home Depot that has a laboratory? Do we ever ask? Does it matter if it's a blood draw or the laboratory analysis? Does it matter if it's routine versus specialized? And how often do we think about any of this? Really, almost never. We never go into this kind of detail. So why are we starting now? Or should we start now? And we should have been doing it all along. What are the implications and whose responsibility is it? Is it the IRB to ask these questions, HRPP to ask these questions, or the PI? But when you send your phase 3 trials to, you know, WCG or Advara, they're doing a timely review. And all of those issues institutionally come back to you. Who's thinking about them? How do you even know about them? Same with digital health technologies. You know, if it's industry supported, largely it's the sponsor's responsibility, and it's got to be compliant, and it's got to be, you know, 21 Part 11 compliant. And if the sponsor contracts with those vendors, what is the PI? What visibility does the PI have into that? But when it's an investigator-initiated protocol, whose responsibility is it to qualify that that device or any tech DHD is fit for purpose? Who looks at the terms of use? Who says whether there's a sculpatory language? By the way, if you read them, there's always a sculpatory language in the terms of use. And is it provisioned or provided by the participant? What does that mean if they have an iPhone versus a different phone versus a flip phone? And then there's training, and then who's providing the data, and how does that get documented, transferred, collected, stored, transferred, stored, and released? So what are the ethical issues? Well, we've touched on some of them. Participant safety, and then the safety and risk mitigation for delivery, storage, use, disposal, all the rest of it for medical products and devices. Incredibly complicated if you don't have, you have to set up a whole system to make sure that that medication is accounted for. The monitoring of and responding to adverse reactions, and then where do participants receive their medical advice and have access to medical care in the event of a problem. Privacy, we've talked about a lot of those, privacy protection challenges, data protection. And then we've got this issue of distributed networks. You know, your medical records are not owned by the researchers. They're owned by different hospitals. There's integration issues. How often do we think about how that data flows from one to the other and who has access to it? Is it synonymized or is it de-identified or anonymized when it gets passed? Is there data minimization, etc.? So all of that should be reflected in the protocol, the safety monitoring plan, the data monitoring plan. When we have an FDA regulated trial, the FDA looks at those. When you have an IIT, how often do you really look at those? Because you're the only ones as an IRB that is looking at those. I mean, yes, the division chair, department chair. I've never met a department chair that doesn't sign that they have read and support a clinical trial. Informed consent, legal permissibility and acceptability, the verification of identity. How do you know that it is that person signing remotely? Does it matter? And how are you going to do that? How do you understand voluntariness? And the understanding of the participant when it's not a direct interaction and it's hard to have that conversation. And then what are the participant concerns? And we've heard from people that when they wear a wearable for, let's say, an activity tracker, they feel constantly surveilled. If they have an iPhone or a Fitbit, they're fine. Of course, they're not thinking about where that data is going, right? So how do you, then the scientific quality and ethics oversight. So here's the problem statement. What ethical issues differ in reviewing or approving a DCT versus a traditional trial versus a clinical trial with DCT elements? What is not different about that? Is a local lab different than a central lab at a performance site? If so, why and when and how? What technology changes does the IRB need to review? And when do you need to see it again? When Epic makes an update and the terms of use changes, how often do the investigators say, well, wait a second, it can't change for my people until, in my study, until I'm sure that the data is going to be equivalent? So we've got to look at all of these: participant burden, minimal necessary connectivity and cost, access complexity, security of device and data, safety, and changes in the relationship and the culture. A lot of participants value the relationship they have with the investigator and put that at a distance, and it changes. So about 2 years ago, in a collaboration with Medable, we got a multi-stakeholder group together, 25 people from all the different walks of life, to address those issues. And we did that by sort of walking through every step. And you're looking at the months of work, because we did 1 or 2 of these every month. And then we wrote up what we found and discussed and researched and circulated and all the rest of it. The good news is, I hope I've sort of indicated how complex this can be. We've done a lot of that homework, and I'm going to share that. I'm not going to go through it. Not going to go through it mostly, and this is what as we evolved, this was the sunrise, we call it, that evolved from that, where every piece of the journey is sort of dissected, thought about. A lot of them won't apply to the trials you're reviewing, but at least you should think about what doesn't apply here and when does it apply there. Because if we don't do the hard work of step-by-step analysis, we'll miss things. And those missed things are going to come back to haunt us at some point. Each of these are clickable, and they're divided, and quality, privacy, security came up so often in every single analysis of the events that we just put it together and said, for everything, there's a underpinning of quality, privacy, and security. in people, it's sort of recruitment, e-consent, direct to participant shipping, participants in technology, notifications and reminders, the help desk. So recruitment, you can have active versus passive recruitment. You can post instead of an advertisement on a bus or in a subway the way we used to see it. You can post something on a social media website. That's different than actively engaging with that website. And if so, what are those differences? And are you respecting user privacy and the terms of that website? You know, we think you shouldn't be snooping, lying, saying you're not a research, investigator. Um, but nobody really thinks about that. And who's reviewing the website terms of use to make sure the investigator, they don't have prohibitions against research? E-consent. There are lots of issues with e-consent. We're all aware of them. But, in my opinion, we've worked out some of these, but not necessarily all of them. The documentation of consent, do we need to worry about what the form of the consent is and whether that matters in terms of the risk of the study? We reviewed a study which was for an anti-arthritis medication, where the informed consent was wonderful, but the actual e-consent on, sort of the phone, at the beginning of somebody talking to you about it, it was very well done. You saw a man walking across a field of dreams on crutches, and by the end of the journey, he had thrown away the crutches and was walking to the sunrise. And I'm like, well, wait a second, is that what we want to be saying? It's all this sort of nuanced background that I wouldn't have thought of reviewing. And then we have people that literally at their IRB ask for a printout of every single screen you can get to. But if you change one screen, do you go back to the IRB to say, I changed page 58? They were printing 500 pages of potential screens. That's not what we should be doing. But then you've got the storage, the documentation of consent, the storage of consent, and will anybody have access to that? If you're using REDCap with, sort of validated, but if you're using something else, who has access to that data? And then there's a whole set of implementation for e-cigs that I'm sure you're aware of. Items being shipped. One of the things we found is that, first of all, you have to worry about stability, but then how's it being delivered? Do you have somebody meet it at the door? Does your participant have to stay home for 4 hours waiting for UPS to arrive or whomever is shipping? How is it labeled? Is it private? Can somebody else sign for it? Et cetera, et cetera. For DCTs, we always have device considerations, equitable access. If you have a provision device, in other words, people bring their device, does everybody have a device? What happens if that device gets lost? What do we do about that? What about children and the laws around children and access to devices? What about prisoners if somebody cannot have a device in a prison? And then the resources for training. Notifications and reminders. One of the things that we found is that a lot of people who are doing DCTs love the fact that they can now ping the participant to say, time for your medicine. Did you fill out your ePro? And that has to be done in a way that does not expose the patient or participant to a risk to the confidentiality, right? How often does that happen? Does it matter if they respond? Do you want them to turn it off or not? All of those kinds of things really drive burden and acceptability and privacy confidentiality. We've also had lost devices. The devices all have to be able to be remotely wiped of this data. And we've got a help desk almost all the time. But there's help desk. Most people will call the help desk if they're working on with a technology, but the help desk is both technical and protocol. So if it's technical, you got to train all of the technical help desk people not to retain participant information, but enough so that they know that it was followed through if they're going to return it, refer it to the protocol folks. So each of these things need to be dissected, considered, and at least for us, we're not doing it. Or we're trying to do it better, I should say. Don't quote me. Um, and then, of course, the vendor qualification. Rewards is really interesting. So with rewards, people have, pay to participate, some remuneration for time and burden or compensation. But now in this world, there's gamification. So if you answer these questions, if you do this on time, if you fill out your ePro, you get points. If you do enough of it, you get a little, a teddy bear, you get a something. But what I didn't anticipate is that some of these are built so that if you only if you give certain information can you get to the next level. That's not okay because people will be hooked into answering these questions. And if they find out they're stuck, it's like paying 99 cents on, on whatever it is, like, you know, one of those games that I play on the airplane, um, that to get you over that level. So you have to make sure there's another way to get there and that it's not asking information that is private, because whatever happens to that information is now available to others. Um, and you can imagine we're all used to smartwatches. All of that data goes somewhere. And they have a lot more data about each of us than any researcher has ever asked in their life. So do we really care? Or or is this different than what they're, so what matters is not that they're doing it, it's what they're asking. Because when people ask for certain sensitive data, private data, or health data, it's not what we're doing in our usual life. So that's the piece that needs to be attended to. So remote data collection or devices remote. These are the kinds of things we looked at, connected sensors, ones that measure your vital, signs, organ or activity, remote visits, devices. These are the things you should be thinking about. The purpose, is it fit for purpose? Monitoring, who's monitoring? What do you get? How do you get help? How do you know it's working? How do you know who's doing the quality control of this? When it gets disposed or stolen, what happens to it? And then remote visits, the same kind of detailed analysis of what's involved in that remote visit and how. We did, sort of go through obsessively, and if you haven't gotten anything from this conversation other than the fact that I'm obsessional about this stuff, this is a good example of, sort of going through trying to ask and think about the different issues. You can read this and say, none of this matters for this trial, but somebody should be thinking about it. The PI should think about it if nobody else. And then devices, big difference between provision devices and bring your own device. If somebody's, if the tech company or the sponsor or you are giving it, if somebody has an iPad, do you let them use their iPad, or are you going to give them an iPad which can be remotely wiped for that specific information that they've now entered on it? And essentially the same list. And then data oversight for real-time data monitoring, study closeout. The real-time data monitoring really gets to the fact that when somebody's being monitored and has a wearable, they think they're being monitored. If somebody's got a heart monitor on and has a heart condition, they think somebody's going to be watching if they get into trouble. And you've got to really carefully explain that whether that's true and you've got an alarm going off if something bad happens, or they should treat it exactly the same. So who's monitoring the data to assure timely identification of adverse events and participant safety? And that is something we've had a lot of problems with, to try and get people to say, look, the pop-off valve, the dangerous signal is this. We're going to set an alert in the technology so that we know either that it comes directly to us or it alerts the patient or participant that they should be alerting someone. And then study closeout very much has to do with understanding where all of this data lives, who has access to it, making sure that you both have source documentation, but also that you've been able to wipe it and know that nobody's seen it. And let me tell you, if you've ever dealt with a privacy breach for a DCT, you want to just like resign, because there are so many vendors and so many places that it's gone. And that is sort of the journey that you take if something goes bad or wrong. But I think if we could do this prospectively, we'd have much better sense of the controls. So what we did here is the website, the MRCT Center website. If you go to that and then click on resources, you'll see the resources, the oversight and implementation of DCTs, and then go to that'll lead you to click on that, and you'll find this full set of recommendations and a clickable image. And you can download the entire checklist. You can download the full PDF of what we did. And each of these buttons are clickable as well, as is the central core issue: quality, privacy, and security. This is an example of e-consent. So you get, on the website, you get a sort of micro explanation of what this is and what you should be thinking about. If you go to the download e-consent, click that button, you'll see the whole thing, so you can, essentially have it and print it or educate with it or adapt it, adopt it, whatever you want. And if you download the checklist, you get something like this. Now, for each of those buttons, there's this kind of detail. If I gave my IRB this packet of details, they would quit. So the question is, what's relevant to this trial at this time? But having a sense of what the flow is for how to think about it is what I would argue is our job today. And so, in summary, there are many advantages of this, including patient centricity. But I want to emphasize the burden on the investigators, their study teams, and it's unfamiliar territory. And the institution has significant responsibilities that I don't think we've communicated as HRPPs. And this goes beyond, to credentialing and quality and what do you need to see and all the rest of it. So I think that there's real work to be done on clarity of roles and responsibilities, including that of the sponsors and the interaction of the sponsors and investigators with the vendors and third parties. Many functions, including remote oversight and monitoring of the trials, require really different thinking. And I'll say, I just spent the weekend with the new, sort of ICH E6R3 that'll be coming out in about 4 months or so. There, it's very much what factors are critical to quality. How do we apply proportionate thinking to each of the things that we review or have responsibility for? And that's what I think we need to now train ourselves to do, not to have a checklist in the end that we just check, but rather think about that trial and what are the risks in that trial at this time. And that gets done at planning, and that gets done with monitoring and oversight. And we only learn what we've done poorly by really having that oversight and being able to correct things in real time. And then I think the legal and institutional concerns must be resolved prior to trial initiation. And when you outsource the IRB, which all of us do now. The problem is our institutions don't even know about some of these risks and can't prepare them in a appropriate way. So with that, thank you, and I'm on time.
Maybe we can get a second handheld mic. Does that other one work? Great, thank you. Well, we have plenty of time for questions and answers, and I would encourage people on Zoom, if you have a question, to go ahead and put it in the chat. Ahmed will be monitoring that and can read some out to us. If you're in the room, we just ask that you press the button, and I think you just press it once and let go, and it turns on, and you can use the microphone so that everyone can hear the question online, and then you can press it again to turn it off. But maybe as folks in the room are starting to ask questions, thanks for such an amazing and comprehensive framework. When you look at all the parts of it, are there parts that you think are more important than others, or places where people tend to go wrong more often than not? Or are there parts that you think actually now need to be improved moving forward with this framework around DCTs?
So thank you. So I think there are a few places where I would say we have not attended appropriately, even in more traditional trials. And all of this is not fully DCT, it's traditional and DCT elements. In fact, even the FDA changed the title of their guidance. But that has to do with the data governance. That's a big, basically new section, by the way, in ICH E6R3, because our data systems have changed astronomically from 10 years ago, from 15 years ago. The number of systems that are integrated now are really challenging. And when we ask for a data map, what elements, who has access, what is the data flow, which we should be doing for most of these studies, if there's any sort of electronic data, for which there is in every trial now, we don't have an answer to that. So I think that is a huge risk. And I think it's also a risk, and I'll say this because your intern is in the room. When we do work with unconsented secondary use, what does it mean if there's a data breach and you have done some analysis on 300,000 unconsented specimens? Headline. So we should be thinking about the way we guarantee the privacy and confidentiality, which we're very good at in care and doesn't have the same sort of controls in research. So that's one thing, big thing, but one thing.
Great example too. I can see the future of that study with unconsented specimens and what would happen if that were to become known. People who didn't even know their specimens were being used perhaps in that way.
And that study wouldn't even come to an IRB, and is a risk for the institution that I don't think the institution has really thought about. We're doing a study right now about consent, front door consents. Like when our participants come in, this is a little off track, but when our patients come in, they sign a hospital consent or a consent for care or whatever. They get a privacy notice. The privacy notice says something about, research and education, but largely it's silent about research and certainly silent about samples. If you look at the hospital consent or the consent to care, on page 7 of 9, in 9-point font, it's got something about, your samples may be used for research and education, and that's it. That's notification. We call it consent, it's notification. And if you say, well, can I read it? Can I just cross this part out? They say, no, you can get your care elsewhere. That's notification. And when things get tough, they call it consent. So those are the things I think we should be thinking about. We've got a much different, you know, less trusting population that we should respect the fact that we haven't well earned their trust.
Questions here in the room? Yep.
Press the button.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Hi, my name is Magdalena Altenberger, and thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, I'm assuming to do this well, there's a lot of different people that have to be involved and have to want to be involved, and they're on different levels of hierarchy and have all sorts of different jobs. So I was wondering if you have any tips or recommendations how to get people on board and how to get them to do their part well without overwhelming everyone, since a lot of people are already overworked. Anything like to put this in practice?
Great question. So, so a couple of things. One is, we were very good about transitioning to remote care and research during COVID-19. We're seeing a huge backtrack because people are comfortable in their comfort zone. And part of that is they're overworked, as you say, but part of it is because a lot of these lines are fuzzy in terms of who's responsible and who's thinking about it. And I think it's an institutional responsibility to do a better job of supporting our investigators and their research teams. And I don't see any real action on that. It's a role for the CTSI if you know, you take it on, but people have to want to be educated. And the fastest way to get religion is to have a problem. And that's the worst thing for the institution. But at least at home, I'm sure it's different here. Research is not the first concern for the institution. And therefore, getting the resources and getting sort of a team, somebody who will sit down with an investigator, which is what I think should happen, who's really thought about this and knows it, and can ask the questions of how do you plan to do this trial? And I would say that that's true for any trial. We see so much that isn't done that should be done at planning. If you have a well-planned trial, it flows. You get recruitment, but we don't do that for our investigators. It's sort of, you make it up and you make mistakes. That's no way to, run an airline kind of thing. So I think if we wanted to work on that, we could do a much better job. Now, after this work, Medable and MRCT Center started working on PI responsibilities because of this problem. And what we don't want to do, and I never give this talk to PIs, by the way, because they'll be like, I'm out of here, got other things to do. But somebody should be thinking about those issues, right?
Other questions? Oh. Sure.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Hi, I'm Terry Hernandez. I'll stand back here. So I think near the beginning, you made a comment I was going to ask you about. So I think for all of us, like the promise of decentralized trials is increased diversity, extending the benefits to research to others who may not have had that opportunity before and beyond. But then you also said, but we don't know that. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that? And yeah, I'm just wondering, because maybe did I assume that we knew that and maybe we don't know that? I'm just wondering.
Data.
Yeah.
Data to say that that's true.
Mm.
And frankly, personally, I'm not looking for that data yet because I want to see the systems catch up with the needs before we evaluate whether or not it's successful or not. I have spent years working on inclusion and representative populations, and I do believe this is important and will sort of substantiate the community outreach that we do. And there are certain trials that are just, we should never do a vaccine trial in a hospital. Never. and we shouldn't do a hypertension trial in a hospital. We should be, so I think this is the right way to go, but we need our systems to catch up with the needs. Now, what we have done is we have grown a cottage industry of vendors that will do this, offer different solutions. Medable is one of them. They're really looking to pharma companies as their clients or their whatever they're called. But I think the academic institutions and the academic trials are far behind in many of the things we do compared to industry, because we don't have the resources and we don't have the infrastructure.
Matt, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. That was wonderful overview. As Matt said, extremely comprehensive. And I would love to dive a little bit into the quality area. I'm thinking about times when there have been, sort of scandals where research ethics has gone off the rails in the clinical environment. And it feels like that's often clinical trials
Yeah.
that have ended up in the news for the wrong reason. It seems like in part, those are often related to either an incentive for people to get enrolled who probably shouldn't be enrolled in the trial, or to stay in the trial when they ought to have been turned away, that kind of thing. And those are more likely when you're decentralized, it feels like, because you've got independent operators enroll, right? All of those healthcare practitioners out there are potentially enrolling folks and getting some kind of an incentive for doing that. So this isn't a new issue, but it feels like an issue that might be exacerbated by a more decentralized approach where you don't have control. Like anyone who does survey research knows this can be a problem, right? People sign up to do the survey because they want the incentive and they just fill everything out the same way, or maybe they weren't even eligible for it. So I think at a couple different levels, if you don't have control, rank fraud is more likely to potentially arise. And I'm wondering if you have creative ways that you've seen people address that, because it feels like along with all the tools that allow decentralized research, maybe there are some tools that might allow better quality control over who's getting into the trial and who stays in the trial and so on.
So really good question. And it does dovetail with all of the challenges we now have with misconduct, and that being very visible to the public, even if it's just a handful of perpetrators in a huge system, it's not helping us. So to your point, I haven't seen anything like that. I'm going to think about it further, but I would say if I had to sort of create the kind of solution I'd think about, it would be something like make sure that when somebody gets enrolled, particularly for an interventional trial, less about survey research, et cetera, but for an interventional trial, I would basically say you want the data reviewed either of enrollment and the qualifications of that enrollment, and have systems set up so you can rapidly do source validation. There's also a sense that what we do or what you should do, and pharma does all the time, is look at competitive enrollment rates, and they see sort of one group enrolling much faster than another, and they're like, why is that? And they'll actually dig in, which you can do at the scales that they work on, because it's always, or not always, but usually multi-site. When we have our small trials that are, always criticized, it's harder to do that. But it's a great point.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
You've talked a lot about kind of an institutional responsibility to have more considerations around DCT, but I wonder if there's room for a dual approach with sponsors as well, and thinking about different ways they help institutions or even patients, right, to have better accommodations or promote research that's more accommodating to them, obviously with risk of data integrity being a huge con for them. But how much do you think weighs on them in addition to the institution?
So, sponsors are all over this, particularly the big sponsors. And you know, there are lots of interesting pieces of this in working with sponsors, which I do, you know, as a core activity. And they're happy to sort of increase the, at least in the US where it's allowable, increase the accommodations generally. It's where the rubber hits the road that is a problem. So what we found, and this is, you know, chilling, but nevertheless, that when, at least locally, and I'm not saying anything about the University of Colorado, when sponsors had in the budget funds for participant compensation and remuneration, I can never say that well, that it went into a bucket basically to be spent. And the investigators often didn't do it because it became part of their sundry funds at the end if it weren't spent. So we, you know, that's one of the things that we argued we should have, you know, Visa cards from a third vendor. And, you know, that was complicated for us. But they've been very good about recognizing the needs. I think it's more challenging with certain disabilities. I think it's hugely challenging with translation. We did a study that looked at the number of trials on CT.gov with one site in the US that required people to read, speak, or write English or be a native English speaker. So guess what that percentage is for adults? What's high? 19%. And if you look at depression, diabetes, cancer, and one other, it's 36%. So PIs didn't even think it was important enough to put it on CT.gov. 36%. We don't have a national language. We might next year, but we don't today. You know, and we're excluding them a priori. Now, I understand that if you're doing developmental language development, but for most of this, it's because it's harder. And, you know, so I do think they're very willing to work with you. So with the translation piece, and I say this for the, you know, contracting group, we now have requirements that they must pay for or provide a translated consent. And my addendum to that is if we translate it, they can have it back to give to anyone. And they've been fine with it. And they've been fine with, actually, there's one company that is paying for unmet the co-pays. But, you know, that's a problem because it can be, and then compensation can be considered income, and there are 12 means tested eligibility programs in the United States for which you can get eliminated if you make certain amount of money. So here we are trying to increase the diversity of our trials, you know, and somebody who makes more than $2,000 about can lose their Social Security benefits. And if you predict, you know, at least here, here in Boston, if you're going to give more than $250, you have to get all the information from the participant. It goes to finance, and that's a risk. During COVID, the NIH required us to get Social Security numbers or ITIN numbers for our participants. And we basically said, we're not going to do it. It was for a vaccine study. And we didn't compete for the phase 2 of that study for RADx because we I just don't think it's right. But this is us, creating problems.
Well, great conversation. Thank